We will disappear unless women choose to have more children.
We've all heard for years that overpopulation has been considered a grave threat to humanity. Now we're basically being told that it's the opposite, that it's now population collapse. If you would have talked to someone about this topic a few years ago about population collapse, they would have told you were crazy. I think now it's becoming more accepted. And in some other podcasts, I heard you talking about the population of South Korea, which is one of the lowest in the world at a fertility rate of 0.7. And basically you say that every generation is 2/3 smaller than the previous generation. And in just 3 generations, you would have about 4% of the original population left, which means that South Korea, which has a population of 51 million, by the end of the century or before the end of the century, would be down to what, like 2 million people?
Almost. So what I'm talking about is not population size with that piece of math. It's generational size. So you look at the size of generations now, and you go from 100 to 4 in just 3 generations. And in Norway, where we decreased by 1/3, in the same period of time, we go from 100 to 30. So it will go really fast, but in the first generation, it will be kind of hidden because we have an aging population. Many countries have pretty high immigration. So if you look at the population number itself, that won't start declining for a later bit, but then suddenly when those tiny generations catch up with you, that collapse will come quite quickly.
Right. So what would be like, say, a number then, and say in 3 generations, because the population would be really old. And then at some point you just have a bunch of boomers or the elderly die off. And then you have essentially 2 million people in this generation. So you're talking like 4 million people or something like that. I mean, it'd be tiny, right? It'd be just tiny.
Yeah, there's going to be very few children unless we're able to do something about this. And it's a difficult problem to wrap your head around because there are so many moving parts. But a good place to start is to look at the declining generation size, because that's what helps you understand what a low fertility rate mean. And there, when you look at 1.4, you get down to 30% in 3 generations. And if you have 0.7, then you get down to 4. And then in the 4th generation, you're down to 1. So we are self-eradicating. We're on the path to eliminating ourselves unless we're able to do something about this. So we should take it seriously.
I just find this really interesting. The history of sort of what was the norm as far as like partnerships from the 1700s or whatever that was to like today. And maybe just walk us through that history and how that changed, and then where we're headed, you think, from like where we are now, then what is going to be considered the norm? And do you reckon, like, are people aware that this might be a pretty catastrophic decline, and as far as like, our existence here?
We have to go a little bit further back, and I'll at least to begin with give you just the rough overview. So I recently published a book called Stories of Love from Vikings to Tinder, where I trace the different mating regimes from antiquity until today. So if anybody wants to read that, it's just search the title, and it's open access, so it's free. The big change that happened with modern societies is that we went away from arranged marriages. In the 2 million year history of humans, it seems like every single human society have had arranged marriages to some extent. People haven't been free to have to choose their own partners. And we tried to implement this regime with the West's second sexual revolution around 1750, but that didn't go too well. So we had to pull back on that. And then since the 1960s, we've universalized as the first human societies individual choice, which in one sense, the most important part of that is that women get to pick their own partners. Women are now free to make those choices both on long-term and short-term markets in terms of sex and pair bonding. This regime has been around for about 50 years. And these deep cultural changes, often it takes 200-300 years to figure out how to make things work. So it's not strange, it's not surprising that we yet to figure out how to reconcile individual needs with societal needs. But if we don't find a solution, if we ignore this problem, we are on path to be the first and last human societies with free women. And I'd like to avoid that. So just pretending that this doesn't happen or that it's not serious, it's that, at least if you're a feminist, that shouldn't be your perspective. I think the number one challenge for feminism today is to find a way to combine having free women making their own choices and having reproduction. Because if the societies with free women self-eradicate, those societies that still have high reproduction are not the biggest champions of women's freedoms. And if we disappear, I don't think they're going to look back at history and say, well, having free women was a good choice. Let's try to emulate that. So this should be a top priority for women all around the world if they want there to be free women also in the future.
Right. Oh, this is a strange one. This seems tough. Like, I don't think people will want to go back to arranged marriages. Like, it'll just seem a little bit like a prison, I feel. Like, do you reckon like we can actually slide back that way, or there's different solutions to move forward?
Yeah, I would
I mean,
absolutely not want that.
I can't do it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of individual choice, and I'm a huge supporter of free women, so much so that I'd like there to be free women also in the future. But now that we are running this experiment and it's leading us to self-eradication, we have to start experimenting with new solutions if we want to avoid being forced back to the old ones. And what those solutions are, I don't know. No one knows. But we have to acknowledge the problem and start discussing what we could be able to experiment with to see if we can have free women and population that doesn't disappear.
We're constantly berated that population is the problem. That the world can't hold. There's a lot of like sort of powers that be, and I won't name names because they'll probably take down this video, but they're saying that we're too many people in the planet. And I guarantee you, do you think that that scared an entire generation or two of having children? I remember when I was younger, I thought that there was too many people in the world. I didn't make it a priority to find a mate and have children. I'm 43 now, and Jesse and I mean, we met a lot later in life as well. And I don't think I'm gonna be able to like make a child at this. Like, you know, I work 100-hour weeks. I just don't think it's gonna be possible now. And so it's like I kind of missed my mark there. But I did kind of have in the back of my head, I was afraid of like, oh, all this pollution that we cause in the world. But that's like my younger years. I've sort of like awakened from that. But do you think like the overpopulation threat kind of held back a lot of women my age and younger?
It is an element, and then the question is how much of the low fertility does that explain? And it seems, we don't know, but it seems not to explain that much. For instance, in Norway, women want 2.4 children, but they have 1.4. So it's not a fear of having children or a fear of overpopulation, at least, that influences their fertility ideals. One of the main drivers of low fertility is people's difficulty with finding a partner. And then also you have that other element of deciding to have a child, but that inability to find a partner in time is very important.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, ideology plays into it also. We just don't know how much. But
How
yeah,
much?
it's
Okay.
and a lot of people, especially in the debate, they mention is no, we're too many people. We need fewer people on the planet, and that's a legitimate starting point. You could say we're over 8 billion. Maybe 1 billion is enough. But then the question is, if we're intent on reducing the population to 1 billion, if that, I'm not saying that's a good choice, but if that is what we want, low fertility is not a great way of doing that. You're just going to run out of children and then you will disappear. And we don't know how to turn this around. It's not like 1.4 means that we're going to go down to fewer people and then maintain our numbers. It means leading experts believe that this is a self-reinforcing process, that the fewer children we have, the fewer children we want to have. So they believe, most experts of the leading experts believe, that fertility rates will just continue declining. And then what happens to civilizations, to societies, when this hits our economy, when we don't have people to work, when that cultural psychology you get from fighting over a shrinking pie. I mean, if we think the solution is to have 1 billion people and we want to maintain civilization so that we can keep our living standards up, that we can keep developing environmentally friendly technologies and take us to a net zero future, if we're going to, you need stable societies and able to achieve those goals. If you want to erase 7 billion people, you're going to have to go Hitler times 1,000. You're going to have to kill the weak ones, the useless ones, the ones that are not holding up civilization. And I hope we don't have the appetite for that.
What do you think made it so difficult for us to find partners? What caused that problem? In the 50s and the 20s, I mean, people were getting married at like 17, 18, 19.
Yep. One key to that is that we now have the first open mating markets where we make our own choices. And I argue that one key aspect of that is the difference between men's and women's attraction systems. So humans have two attraction systems. We have the promiscuous attraction system, which is the original one. This is what we had when we were with our last common ancestors with chimpanzees, and this is how most animals make. Women are only attracted to the most successful males because that's the most effective way of distributing the most functional genes within a population. And then because hominin offspring became so needy, our heads got so big, our development period prolonged, it became very beneficial with pair bonding. So we became one of the species that developed pair bonding around 4 million years ago. And their men and female attraction systems are kind of similar. You fall in love with somebody in a monogamous regime with someone who has a similar mate value as you have, and you pair bond. While the promiscuous attraction system, because men and women face different evolutionary challenges, they turn out quite differently. Men's promiscuous attraction system is very generous. Perhaps most men would want to sleep with most women. In the past, that would be a way of ensuring a large genetic legacy. While because women could only have, say, one child a year, or in reality had a mating cycle of around 3 to 4 years, for them, the most important part would be to secure a partner that can protect them and provide resources. So that's in terms of pair bonding. In terms of promiscuous mating, they would choose the partner that had the best genes. That is what they're incentivized to do, because if they're only going to get the genes, then they should be as good as possible to ensure a good life for their offspring and that offspring's ability to pass on their genes. So in today's society, and we see this it's very clear on the data you see from online dating. For instance, on Tinder, women, the first thing the average woman does is to delete 95% of men from her reality, and they're just swiped away. So while men swipe yes on more than half of women on average only accept the top 5%. And then in the next, after they've eliminated 95%, in the next filtration, 98% of those men disappear. And then out of the men women meet, 80% are filtered out. So you have this very strong filtration because women have the power on short-term mating markets for two reasons. Men have a much higher desire for partner variety. For instance, in Norway, men would like 25 partners in their lifetime, while women would only want 5. So this means there's a much higher demand for female sexuality than the supply, which means that women have the power on that market. And then in addition, women are only promiscuously attracted to a very small proportion of men. And we see this is why when an earlier article suggested the term instincts, involuntary single women, to describe how many women on today's mating markets have a problem finding a partner because their dating efforts are aimed at the very most attractive men, and those men will typically not be available for pair bonding, just promiscuous sex.
How do you define attractive man? Like, I know in a lot of your articles, you talk about high value women and high value men. So can you kind of explain what a high value woman is and a high value man? And then you also talk about low value men and low value women. So what is a low value man and a low value woman?
Yeah, no, that's actually very easy and circular. It's whatever your community decides. So if you have an in-group or a community, and they will, if you ask them all to rate everyone, then they will have different opinions, but then you'll end up with an average. Say on a scale from 1 to 100, somebody might be a 70. And then you will see that people that have a mate value of around 70, as ascribed to them by the community, have a tendency to find partners for pair bonding that have a very similar value. So it's whatever a community values in terms of intelligence, kindness, resources, physical appearance, etc. It's whatever goes into that. Then you ascribe a value based on it.
It seems like at least for men, when you say high value, a big chunk of that percentage is how much money you have. And I thought it was interesting in one of your papers, you said that in repeated surveys of undergrads, they found that 70% of females would prefer being the second wife of a billionaire rather than the exclusive wife of an average man. I was actually talking to one of my friends about this, and he's like, I'm surprised it's 70. I thought it'd be like 95%. But
yeah, that varies culturally too. That was in America. I think in Scandinavia, which are much more egalitarian, both in terms of gender and economics, I think women place a lower value on a man's economic resources than in America, or I would imagine that it's even starker in countries that have more income inequality. When there's a lot of income inequality, women have a tendency to aim more of the dating efforts towards the very most economically resourceful men.
Right, because you're basically saying a high value man is determined by your peer group. Well, that peer group's going to be different in the U.S. versus Norway or
If you're a hunter-gatherer, your ability to bring home the meat is crucial, while your ability to bring home meat from hunting in the US is of less importance to women today.
Yeah, that makes sense. I definitely want the one who can bring in some food if I lived in rural Africa.
So that's just the basic
Survival.
evolutionary challenges for the sexes have been different. For women, the foundational evolutionary challenge for the last 4 million years is to gain access to men resources because they needed it, because they give birth, they had children, they needed help with those. And then the main evolutionary challenge for men has always been to gain access to female sexuality. And that has shaped our psychologies to a significant extent. So there's nothing wrong with a woman being drawn emotionally to a man who has economic resources. That just goes against the ideology of romantic love that was hegemonic from the early 1800s to the 1960s. And we still have residuals of that in our mind. So we think that it's wrong for a woman to be attracted to resources. But female emotions of love evolved to ensure paternal investment, to have the man that she became pregnant with invest in the relationship and the offspring. It's just that women today now are, and I think that's wonderful, freer. They make their own money, and in Scandinavia, we transfer a lot of women, a lot of money to them through the welfare state, and that makes for good societies. But that also makes men less attractive because women evolved to appreciate what men could bring in of resources. And now that we created society where women are much freer from men resources and therefore don't need a man as dearly as they needed when we lived in more impoverished environments, we have to find new ways to make women meet and fall in love with men with similar values so that they can have relationships and have children. And if we're not able to do that, we'll disappear.
You're talking about the state of Norway taking care of some of the women. I was shocked when I was reading that you say that Statistics Norway calculated that the average Norwegian woman over a lifetime receives $1.2 million more from the state than she pays in tax. The average man pays more in tax than he receives in support. So Norway, as always, everyone, at least in the US, is always like, oh, these Nordic countries have really good social programs and stuff. Yet the fertility rate in Norway is 1.4. The fertility rate in the USA is 1.62. Europe as a whole, something like 1.46. And Norway is pretty much on average. It's slightly below, but it's pretty much on average with the rest of Europe as a whole, even though you have these massive social programs. And I was shocked when you also said that in a podcast I heard, about $1.2 million more that they pull out than they put in. That's insane.
Yeah, and the 1.2 million, that's still good money. What's interesting is that if the three of us had this conversation 15 years ago, I would have very smugly schooled you on how to fix your fertility crisis. In the 2000s, Scandinavia had the answer. You saw across the Western world fertility rates shrink, and ours in Norway was 2.0 all the way up to 2010. And we knew this was because we had social democratic welfare and free women. We had greater gender equality. So if America could just copy Norway, you'd get your fertility rate up. And then to everyone's surprise, over the past decade and a half, it's just plummeted. So now, social democratic welfare and gender equality is great. It makes it materially easier for women to have children, but it makes it harder to find partners that are good enough, that women experience to be sufficiently attractive for them to be willing to pair bond with them. And then with how Tinder has enhanced that and given women access to unlimited amounts of highly attractive men for sex and dating, for some women that makes it harder to recalibrate their mating strategies if they want to find a man that is willing to be their boyfriend, somebody they can have a pair bond with and then later reproduce.
Yeah. Do you think that women's standards of finding a partner will shift eventually as this kind of problem gets more and more dire, like 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now, where it's like, well, we need to make babies?
I don't know.
So that it'll shift,
I think different countries will experiment through different paths with this. In Scandinavia, I don't think we're going to go that way. Female choice is our highest value, and we've created great societies for implementing that. So we'd be then at least among the very latest nations to start to impose on women that they need to lower their standards or yeah. I don't see that happening here. I see some other countries that might choose that path of experimentation.
I saw you on a podcast, the Modern Wisdom with Chris Williamson, and he's saying like, were you like getting censored for discussing the kind of the dire fertility rate situation in Norway, and then that basically you were having a conversation. It sounded like maybe a debate, and we're talking with this lady who basically is like, yeah, we should have less kids because we spend so much money on our social welfare programs that it's actually a benefit to have less people, I guess, pulling out. And then you asked her like, but isn't our fertility rate of 1.4 mean that every generation we're essentially shrinking by 1/3, or that generation is shrinking by 1/3, and after three generations it's already down 70%?
Yep.
And then you basically mentioned in a lot of your papers like this is maybe the gravest threat to civilization. Why are you getting censored, or or at least I mean, is that the right word? Or were you getting, I guess?
I saw Chris Williamson's team change the graphic to that I was canceled for fertility research. I haven't been canceled and I haven't been censored. I've just met a lot of not well thought through criticism where people are just angry at me and making ad hominem attacks and misrepresenting my position. So it's quite a few. Many of the biggest experts in the field have gone out and disproven my claims. And not a single one of them actually used the claim that I've made. So so the researchers and bureaucrats in Norway in this field have all convinced themselves through being ideologically blinded that they under no circumstance must portray low fertility as negative. So he, who I consider to be Norway's greatest expert on this, he wrote a book in 2022 that's called Decline and Prosper, where after writing a really good book, he then concludes that, yes, politicians have to stop asking people to have more children and start asking how we can have good lives with fewer children. Not only to embrace low fertility, but to celebrate it. But they all know what 1.4 means, that it will self-eradicate. So then I finally, because I've been talking to all these experts for so long, and then in this debate, she finally burst after I had annoyed her long enough. And she said, but yes, I can tell the audience that each generation will decline by 1/3. But you can't portray this negatively because then we empower the right wing, which in Norway isn't really a thing. I mean, even our right-wing party, our feminist social democrats, nobody here is waiting to use low fertility to turn Norway into a Handmaid's Tale. So, but yeah, that is, it's just they convince themselves that got to keep a smile on, can't portray this negatively, or somebody will come and take away Norwegian women's rights and force them. Like the parody of the criticism I've gotten is that I'm a misogynistic fascist who wants to use the state to force women to breed with incels. And I'm not doing that at all. I'm just pointing out that our societies are great, having free women are great, and it would be really tragic if the first human societies with free women self-eradicated. And I understand that feminists don't want to talk about this because it is female mate preferences that is driving parts of this, but that's not women's fault. Women are no more in charge of the nature they were born with than men are. We could also blame men for desiring high partner variety. I mean, if we're going to blame aspects of our nature, that's going to be a long and dumb discussion. The fact of it is that we need to solve this, and we need to find new solutions, because if we don't find new solutions, those old solutions will force themselves on the female and male population once our modern open societies have self-eradicated.
I want to ask about the emotional impact. I think you mentioned that I'd read, Jesse sent me, that polygyny or polygamy may be a solution for this. I've worked for a lot of rich people, and some of the conversations I mean, they essentially, the gist of sort of what I got in some conversations is they would like to have many children with many women, but not exactly tied to them. Just, but they want to leave their seeds around. And that's just sort of like they want heirs or whatever.
Yeah.
But emotionally, I might find it that difficult, to like, most women would want to have a mate, stay with them, have the, the nuclear family, whatever. So a lot of people don't want to go in sort of that, that kind of relationship. So how does emotion play a part in that solution not working exactly the way you're thinking of?
Yeah, no, polygyny is interesting. Our species as male humans have a fairly strong polygynous drive. During our hunter-gatherer days, we couldn't really afford too much polygyny. Typically, even the best of hunters couldn't afford to provide for more than 4 women. But then when powerful men could accumulate everyone's resources and start hoarding women, they did so to a very strong degree. What we blind ourselves to is, it's a common thing to say that polygyny favors men. That is dead wrong. That is, we think that way as a result of the founding fallacy of feminism. Big supporter of feminism, it's achieved great things. But the feminist view is that to understand gender relations, you have to separate between men and women. Quite often, a more relevant separation is between high-value men and women on one side and low-value men on the other. So polygyny, for the vast majority of men, is terrible because the men with the resources, they hoard the women, and then there are no mating opportunities left for men in general. This is probably what drove the Viking Age, that the elites had just hoarded all the women, and if men wanted access to the women, they had to go out and rob Europe, and technology made that possible at the time. But yeah, it's for men in general, polygyny is not good. And for women, it's a trade-off. So in our modern societies, you can provide for yourself, and even if you have a poor man, you'll get your calories. But in the past, when you had the choice between being the third wife of a man with abundant resources or the only wife of a man who couldn't feed his family, then the first choice was probably preferable. So yeah, we're now in a situation today where women's attraction to men evolved from much more impoverished environments. And now in the debate that's been in Norway, women's been very clear, very open about this. Men are not good enough. They're just not good enough. And if they don't become better, they're not interested in pair bonding. So women are already excluding an increasing proportion of men from their pool of potential partners. And then we could ask ourselves, if we're going to keep reproducing, would women want to share men? I mean, women already do temporally. High-value men are recycled. He's with one woman, have children with her, and then with the next. Would women prefer to share these men at the same time so they don't have to break up the family when the high-value man gets a new woman? I mean, that's not for me to decide. I'm not a part of that. But if men simply aren't good enough, is that an option for you? Is that something you would like? Would Norwegian women want us? Are there countries in the world where there are men that are good enough? Could we import those? Would you prefer to have children alone? Should the government supply you with a nice apartment and a salary for bringing up children, and then you'll just have children with whomever you want and raise them on your own? What kind of solutions would we want in the future if men in general aren't good enough for women? And yeah, what would it take? And I don't know what the answer to that is, but women have to engage in this debate, especially feminists, and start negotiating. What would you like? Now, like you said, in Norway, women get $1.2 million from the state. Do you need 4? Do you need $2 million? How much do you need? What will it take for you to be willing to reproduce? So women are in a wonderful position for negotiations. They have the power here now. We will disappear unless women choose to have more children. And then women need to get involved. Let us know what it is you need. What kind of society do you envision today and in the future that would make it sufficiently attractive to have children?
Maybe right now we can take a step back, just because I in the comments, people always say like, oh, like it'd be good if we had lower population, and they list all the benefits, but it's just like, well, that's not really, what they think, like, oh, the housing prices are going to go down, or I can get into some great college or whatever, but that's not really what's going to happen. And all you have to do is look at a place like, Detroit or the Rust Belt in the US, where it was booming in the 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever. And now they're ghost towns. I mean, if you don't keep up your houses and things like that, basically after like 7 years, they're decrepit. I mean, in Japan, as soon as you buy a house, it loses value just like a car in the US. And then, as someone else buys the house, they just tear it down and build a new one, right? But for all the people that think there's going to be massive benefits to a shrinking global population. What do you say to them?
What the massive benefits would be of a shrinking population?
No, for all the people that think there's a bunch of benefits to a shrinking population, what would you say to those people?
Yeah, so again, it's complex. So let's say if we lived in a technologically static world and we would move into the future based on what the world is today, this is probably going to be dreadfully dystopian. I mean, it's going to be so nightmarish to see populations just collapse and disappear. That's not going to be a fun time. But we don't live in a technologically static world. We have robots on the way. By 2040, Elon Musk will have built somewhere between 10 and 30 billion Optimuses. AI is coming. Automation is coming. There's a lot of pieces in play. So then the question, I am somewhat optimistic because I believe that in the long run, technology is going to change our environment so drastically that we might have a golden age of reproduction. I mean, think about it. If you never had to work, if your material security was there for life and you could trust that, and you had robot nannies and the help of an AI that's a billion times smarter than you to facilitate a wonderful life, I think what I was talking about, rich people want tons of children. I think people in general want tons of children if they're not that costly, and if you can have robots look after them. So I think the environment we will live in after the fourth industrial revolution will be so novel that it's hard to see what kind of mating we'll be doing then. We'll have gene editing, artificial wombs. So in the long run, I choose to be naively optimistic, but as societies, we need to discuss this now. And if we are going to adapt to that world that is coming, we need to have an ongoing conversation as these new technologies show up and find cultural solutions that allow us to implement them in a way that keeps up our populations. So yeah, it's hard because we don't know how this will play out. Humanity hasn't had this problem before. We haven't been in a cultural change as deep as the one we are in now, probably. And technologically, it's going to be such a novel world that the honest answer is we don't know how the future will play out. But we need to have this conversation about these fertility rates because maybe the magic machine of the future won't save us after all. And even if we do get a lot of robots, maybe there would be a point to having humans around still.
What we would most likely see is a negative growth model. We'd have a negative GDP, the first time basically in like global history, at least in the last couple thousand years.
Not with robots. If Elon is able to do what he says, then we're going to live in a society with unlimited production, and we don't know.
Right, but let's assume that the robots is way further off. I've done 2 podcasts on AI, and both were computer scientists, PhDs, work in the industry, and they both say it's way overhyped and it's going to be decades. I mean, I know you reference Yuri quite a bit, and I think he's just a WEF puppet, and I tend not to believe too much what he has to say. But I think he's giving you kind of the optimistic view. Maybe the experts I had on were a little bit, less bullish on it, maybe more of a pessimistic view. But let's just say hypothetically that the AI is, 40, 50 years off, then what's the next, 30 years going to look like, 40 years going to look like?
Closing of schools. So let's say the next 10, 20, 30 years, we still have the generations that are in the labor force now. They're still going to be there. People are going to live longer. That's another aspect here with longevity. Some experts in that field think we'll be facing some kind of immortality. Maybe we don't need to reproduce. There's a lot of moving parts. But over this century that we're in now, you will just notice that the absolute population numbers won't decrease that much. It's just that everybody's going to get really old, and every decade there's just going to be fewer children until there's very, very few left. And that's a very different world than the one we're living in now, and that will have consequences for first what all the schools we have to shut down, and then when there's many fewer people going into the labor force, and then there's the question of what kind of healthcare can we have for old people? We're going to have an enormous amount of old people, and what are we going to do? Enslave all young people to take care of old people and not do any production? It's that population pyramid is going to get very unhealthy.
So it's going to be like an economic decline. We can't build things because you need the younger generation to build.
In a technologically static world, that would be the nightmare scenario that we would be entering into.
Right. But if we had robots to do, I see what you're saying. So, I mean, man, if these robots existed like 20 years ago, I bet you I would have had 10 children in my 20s.
Yeah.
It would have been so easy. Hey, cook breakfast.
Yep.
Yeah.
No,
Travel to school.
children are great.
Made life easy. I would have had 10 children.
Yep. And I think many would. So I think if that utopian future plays out the way some experts predict it will be, and that some makers are trying to build, then I think things look good. But I mean, it's the way we're headed now is self-eradication, and that should be we should talk about it more than we do, and we should try to do something that doesn't entirely rely on the magical machine saving us at some point in the future.
Yeah. Do you think that they're gonna start creating? I don't know. This is kind of far-fetched, maybe, but do you think that the idea of people making children in petri dishes is a reality in the future at some point?
Yeah.
And then you adopt a child, a lab-made child.
Well, my guess would be that we're going to try to lean into people's preference for genetic offspring. So it will be you and your partner's child that will be genetically edited. And
so engineered, yeah.
So gradually kids will just get better and better. And they will be considered immoral to raw dog children and just throw the dice, because then they're going to be so far behind all the perfect children of your neighbors. So yeah, I do predict that in the future that's the direction we'll be going to, and we'll be gene editing.
That would be
to some extent merging with machines. Yeah, so we're at the present. We're living in a very exciting time, and what I've done in my research is to study deep cultural changes of the past. And they are difficult. They are very hard, and things fall apart. And and you need. It can at least be very helpful to have broad discussions to kind of bring people along with that cultural change and find out what's salient, what people want. And now that we're experiencing this unique fertility challenge, we really need to get on board, because it's so serious. I mean, it is. The stakes couldn't be higher.
I just don't think like people are aware. Like, I mean, I didn't know that this was a big problem. I guess that in a way I'm part of the problem because I never had children, but I hope to adopt one day. But not a lot of people are aware that this is a major problem, to be honest. So
yeah, no, we need to develop new culture. Mostly when we think about things, we rely on cultural scripts that we've been fed when we grew up. So this is how we should think about this. This is how we should think about that. And we have pretty strong cultural scripts for overpopulations. And then when a new problem arises, people like you, people like podcasts, people like new researchers, we just need to have public conversations and invite people into it so they can start thinking more thoughtfully around new challenges, especially a challenge that is so severe as this. But yeah, it is for many people, it's highly provocative, and women are rightly concerned for their freedoms, that these societies with free women, they don't reproduce. And then the first thought you have, oh no, we're going to go back to those dark ages. And yes, we might end up in those dark ages, but before we end up in those dark ages, let's really try to avoid it. Our ancestors faced challenges evocative of this again and again, and they always managed to get through it. So this is a really severe challenge, but I think it's well within the capacity of Homo sapiens to solve also this 21st century reproductive crisis.
You study incels, and was it insigs?
Instincts, yeah, involuntary instincts.
Right, voluntary, right. And I mean, just like all these terminology, I never even heard the term incel. For maybe the first time I heard it was like, I don't know, 6 years ago or something like that.
Huh?
And is this a kind of so Kai and I are both in our 40s, but is this kind of like a new phenomenon, or is they just actually just like putting a name?
Ancient as humanity itself. Involuntary celibate men or unpaired men has always been, almost always been, to various extents, a big thing. So out of our ancestors, or out of all humans who lived to adulthood, perhaps 80% of women had children, while perhaps only 40% of men. And all humans, more than 80% of human societies have had polygyny as kind of their norm. So you've had an extension, and even in those that didn't have it in norm, it was still practiced. So there's always been a very, but varying environment, there's been a strong stratification between men in terms of their access to women, sexually and romantically, and for fatherhood. What happened was that the church around the year 1200 with the first sexual revolution imposed lifelong monogamy on everyone, even the most powerful of men, and they were very, very serious about it. And that's the reason we're able to talk to each other across between different continents. We would not have had modernity. That was the foundational change, to impose on people lifelong monogamy. And that created a uniquely sexually egalitarian environment in Europe from the first to the, say, third sexual revolution, where men in general, where most men and most women paired up. In the 50s, when this regime peaked, almost everyone were married and did so early. And then when we opened this up, we went back to the old regime of strong stratification between men, but there's a very significant difference. So before, around 1200, men engaged in status contests among themselves, and then the winner of those status and resource contests acquired the women they wanted and could afford. That's what drove the stratification. What we have after the third sexual revolution of the 1960s is a similar stratification, but it's now driven by female mate preference. It's those men who are best able to adapt to women's mate preferences on short and long-term markets to get all the mates, instead of then going to war or chopping each other's heads off. So it's a similar stratification. So incels have always been a thing, but to a much lesser extent during those centuries that modernity emerged, and those were related, where everybody could pair bond. It puts a discipline on them. It makes them more long-term, changes their psychology. They invest more in the pair bond and their offspring. So that laid the foundation for the later industrial revolutions. But yeah, now we're back in a situation where there's a lot of men who are being excluded from mating. But that was the experience of almost all our ancestors. That's always been common.
In one of your papers, you write that I argue that permitting polygamy could be the most effective means at our disposal for countering a too rapid decline in fertility. So it seems like in this situation, you're optimizing for fertility. But since you've studied the entire human history of reproduction and mating rituals, what is the most, I guess you could say, optimum for society? What's the most optimum for fertility? I mean, like, there's a lot of different. Yeah. Right. What's the most optimum for you? You write a lot about happiness. I mean, what's the most optimum for happiness? I mean, it seems like if you optimize for one thing, then you're going to, something else will kind of de-evolve.
Yeah. So first of all, I do not personally support a return to polygyny for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons is it's a really shitty deal for most men. It really marginalizes men when the highest value men start hoarding women. The other aspect is, I think, in today's world, if you're a high-value man and you have 10, 20, 30, 40 new sex partners a year, would you be incentivized to take on 4 wives and live with them and provide for them and their children? And also there's a disconnect. A man's ability to get women to bed today does not necessarily, that's not the same as being able to provide for 4 families. It's like you said, yeah, women do have a preference for men with resources, but that's not enough. Hotness plays into it, etc. So it's not that easy. So I don't know if you could motivate, how long it would take to motivate Western men to start having 4 wives and 16 children. I'm not sure that would be a quick fix. My point with the article was to show that, yeah, there are all these are the tools that are available to us. Out of those, polygyny would be the least culturally awful, while still culturally awful in the West. We do not have an appetite for polygyny, among other things, because we do think it is bad for women. And it was in antiquity. It did commoditize women. And you would think perhaps if women are so sought after and fought after, they would be freer, but in reality, it become more like commercial goods that are exchanged between families. Yeah. So back in that environment, that was not empowering for women. It could be in today's environment. We don't know. But yeah, so there were all these things we could impose: poverty, de-urbanize, become less feminist, strengthen the patriarchy, have more communal ideology. There are many things we could do that would likely have an effect, but all of those are untenable for our ideology. So my point with that article is to show that we don't have any tools. And we see that with the political economic tools that are being experimented with too now, they're not workable. So we need to think new, and we need to think radically new if we're going to do something about this.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I also feel it'd be so, I also feel it'd be so lonely. Like, isn't it like at the core of everything you sort of want like that deep connection with someone, essentially? Like, then otherwise it's just sort of blank. And you have these 16 wives or 4 wives or whatever, and you're going from one place to another, raising a child just for the sake of raising a child. And you kind of live life without that, the love that essentially that we all seek, I feel. Because I feel like aren't we like more lonely than we ever were these days?
Yeah,
You
I
know,
don't. I
with
think
social media and
I think being single is more lonely than living in a household with 40 people. But I see what you mean. You're talking about that dyadic connection with one partner that is only yours. Yeah, I think most people crave that. And then if the alternative is being single or
interesting.
sharing your husband with someone, or yeah, I don't. This is for women to decide. Would you
Yeah.
is if first of all, should we have societies in the future or should we eradicate? Okay, if we should exist in the future and men aren't good enough and women aren't willing to lower their demands,
Yes.
if they need a man that they feel a certain type of attraction to, and there's so few of those men, if you want to share them, I think we should be open to that.
Yeah. The way I see it too, there's another thing. Well, I don't know. This just popped in my head, but do you reckon incentives and sort of tax benefits for if you want to be a single mom, raise a child, just get more incentive? Like they start incentivizing women to where it's like, okay, you get to have your living a livable, wage or welfare, whatever, for you to raise more children.
Yeah. So
That might be a move.
Yeah, our Western way of thinking primes us to believe that works. That's why in the American debate for a long time, the argument from feminists have been turn America into Scandinavia. We need equality, we need maternity leave, we need all these supports, we need free daycare. We have all that in Scandinavia. Everything an American feminist can imagine and desire, we already have that in Scandinavia, more or less, unless she's very imaginative. But we have a great system in Scandinavia. There's never been an easier place to have children. In a way, you could argue against that, but materially and in terms of economic support, it's really great. And our fertility rate has plummeted. So, and also we see that with experiments that have been done that try to what you were talking about were targeted payments. If you do this, you get this money. That seems to have. I haven't done the research. I've only read the research, and it surprises me because why can't you economically incentivize women to have children? You would think that's classical economic thought, but those kind of targeted payments they haven't worked, and generally, and non-targeted payments, just dropping money over people, that does have a positive effect on fertility, but because it's not targeted, the cost per extra child is prohibitively high, or it's very high. In one study showed that in Poland it was $1 million per extra child, in France $2 million, which are substantial sums. So it's we just the conventional political tool chest doesn't work. It seems, from my point of view, it's obvious that we need a cultural change. So in the book I told you about, Stories of Love from Vikings to Tinder, I traced the evolution of Western ideologies of love from the 1200 up until today. And we have changed our ideology of love. And that is, what do we think about sex, pair bonding, children, men and women? And different ideologies motivate different behavior. And the ideology we have now, which is called confluent love, which sanctifies convenience, reward, and individualistic self-realization, that does not to a sufficient extent motivate pair bonding and reproduction. So I'm thinking, if we talk about this, we experiment with solutions, we try to upvalue being a mother, being a father, having children, family. If we're able to do that, over time our culture will change, and that culture will motivate people to have more children. So it seems like economic benefits in the current culture will not have the effect we desire, but through doing those experiments and upvaluing having children, I think in the longer run we can get the cultural change that is necessary.
So incentives do work, right? We incentivize people to shift behavior. And so in here in the United States, I had a single mom. It was very difficult to grow up with a single mom. We were poor. There's some kind of a stigma with single moms and welfare. Basically you grow up really poor. and the direction of your life is kind of like a little different than if you had a 2-parent household or had more means, yada yada. So let's say you're saying in Norway, you guys have better systems for these type of things. So I was wondering, what is the difference? So if I were a single mom, let's say I got pregnant, and let's say the guy didn't want to stay, and now I have to raise this child, either abort child or raise a child. I'm always going to go with raise child. Um, would there what is in place in Norway that sort of nourishes that for the mother to raise this child?
Yeah, no, I grew up with a single mother as well. She got pregnant. She was 17. What Norway does is that firstly, the man has to pay, and he has to pay a lot.
Okay.
And if he doesn't pay, the government will pay that for him. In addition, the government will pay. Daycare is more or less free. It's subsidized. I think it's around 85% subsidies. It's very affordable. And you get a certain sum of money, not a large one, certain sum of money every month for having a child too. Education is free if you're a single mom, and if you want to get education, that is even more beneficial. If you're unemployed, unemployment tends to be really good. Social welfare is also at a different level than in the US. So through all these economic stimuli, we've created society that the UN generally every year says that Norway is the best country in the world to live. So we have created really good societies.
Yeah.
And the key to that has been to transfer so much money to women. Women need them, among other reasons, because they tend to take care of the children in case of breakups.
Yeah.
Also, women live longer. They choose lower paying jobs. They work less. So transferring that money makes for good societies. But then an unfortunate side effect is that men become less attractive in the eyes of women when women do not depend on the resources to the extent that they used to.
Got it. Because now they have another resource to live.
The state now provides a lot of what they used to rely on partners for, which is great for women and societies and for children. I mean, the upside is significant, but it also has adverse effects in terms of pay money. In terms of what you said earlier about, fortunately, since I lived up in Norway, even though I had a single mom, our neighborhood wasn't plagued with crime or drug, or even though we lived in a neighborhood with a lot of single parents, it's just a very different environment that makes that kind of upbringing easier. But it seems logical that if you're growing up in a harsh environment, that's no place to have a children, right? Well, if you grow up in a wonderful environment like Norway, where everything is so convenient, you should start early and have tons of children.
Yeah.
Our psychology doesn't work that way. Within evolutionary sciences, we have terms what we call fast life strategy and slow life strategy. So fast life strategy is what your organism motivates you to adopt when things are tough, because there might not be a tomorrow. And the purpose of all life is to replicate DNA. So if times are tough and testy, you will be incentivized to hurry up your reproduction. While if things are really good, then you're incentivized to wait, to invest in yourself, to invest in finding a partner, and then to raise your standards. So that's one aspect. There's a lot of elements that play in, but bad times in general, depends on what kind of bad times, seems to motivate early reproduction and early reproduction, while these prosperous, wonderful societies we have now pull us in the other direction, as you see with how late people are to reproduce. We start really late compared to what we did in many earlier times, even though that is varied as well.
Yeah, I think one of the big topics we haven't touched on quite yet is immigration. Like specifically in the US from like 2000 to about 2009, 2010 was right around the replacement rate. And then after the great financial crash of 08, we started seeing the effects of a declining fertility rate. But the US has had an increase in population because of, we have a massive influx of immigrants. And of course, in the recent presidential debate, immigration was kind of at the forefront of that. And in Europe, you had was it the 2014 refugee crisis, things like that. And so immigration, I think the last decade plus has been a pretty big issue. But if we have an overall decrease of the global fertility, so we have less children everywhere, where are the immigrants going to go if every country has less children or less supply to kind of move around? So how do you see kind of immigration factoring into countries kind of like being able to maintain their replacement rate, being able to maintain their tax base, things like that? I mean, I've read books, I've had, this is like the 10th podcast I've done, and they say we're going to be fighting over immigrants in the future and things like that. Do you think that's actually true? And what's kind of your overall thesis when it comes to immigration?
Integration is integral to this. Plan A, conscious or pre-conscious, was that we were going to solve this with immigration in the West. In Norway, first 15 years of this century, we tripled our immigration population, so we're now more than 15%, and we thought that would help keep fertility rate up. A surprising aspect is that, because a lot of people, especially on the far right, they think, oh, these fertility rates are false because all these Muslims we have in our country, they're breeding like rabbits and the white ones aren't. That's not the fact. Immigration populations adapt really quickly to the impulses of their new environment. So you'll see when they come to Norway, they have much higher fertility, and within 10, 15 years, they're right down by the Norwegian one. Because, they face the same challenges in Norway with having children as Norwegians do. Interestingly, in Denmark, which has a fertility rate of 1.6, the immigration population have a fertility rate of 1.4. So importing people from high fertility nations does prop up your population, but it seems to not increase your fertility rate. It just postpones the problem. And then in welfare states like Norway, where women cost 1.2 million, many immigrant groups are almost double that. So Norway and Europe aren't as good as the U.S. at integration. I mean, the U.S. has always been a nation of immigrants, so you're good at integrating people. We're not that good in Europe. So the economic aspect of immigration, we face a different equation than what you do in the U.S., where you have less welfare and a stronger integration. And then, as you mentioned, we will be running out of countries from which to import immigrants. This is a global trend. The countries that are still reproducing are predominantly across Africa, Middle East, and a little bit further east. But also there, it's trending downward. And then you have to ask yourself, let's say if you jump 3 generations ahead, if Norwegian generational size is only 30% of what it is today, or even lower, you'd be importing every year. For every 3 kids you have, you'd be importing 7 from other nations. And that is a cultural challenge. Maybe we'll figure out how to do that. But then also, why would we take the people from other countries? I mean, not out of some kind of xenophobia, but why are we entitled to import everyone else's people just to keep our societies going? Is it realistic that they're even going to want to come? I mean, if you have healthy working societies, do you want to go join a dying nation? Yeah. So immigration, it's complex, and in the short to mid run, having high integration could have some upsides, but it doesn't seem like the long-term solution to the fertility crisis. I think the long-term solution is that if we want to be around, we're going to have babies.
Yeah, simple as that. Is India and China also trending downward?
China is doing worse than almost everyone. China is probably down to, their numbers are very uncertain, but they're probably down to 1.0. Some cities, from what I've seen, is down to 0.5. China is in dire straits. Some experts are very pessimistic towards even just the mid-range viability of the Chinese nation, considering how their population numbers are dropping.
Didn't they get rid of the one-child policy?
Not only have they got rid of the one-child policy, they have advertisements for, was it like 3 children now, or as many as you can? I've seen that recently.
Yeah, no, I recently had a discussion with a China expert who let me in on how seriously China are taking this and how they're going to try to fix this in the long run, and how they have some new equality laws that are much better than the ones in the West. I mean, female protections in China now are being significantly ramped up. So yeah, if you're a feminist and you want to,
wow, that's unheard of.
China is leading the way there because they think that they need to make great societies for women if they're going to motivate women to have children. And yeah, hopefully they'll make some headway there. But it'll be interesting. It's going to be interesting to see, because all nations now have to start. Some nations started experimenting with publicly created dating apps. I think Japan, and I don't remember the other country. But yeah, the government's getting into the dating app business, and that's going to be interesting to follow.
Oh my lord. Oh, that's because they want the data.
Now they want people to have more children, and they know that Tinder are incentivized to keep you single.
Okay.
So they want to create dating apps. I've looked into it myself. I've discussed this with some colleagues. If there is some kind of project we could do to see if what would a dating app that promotes long-term pair bonds and reproduction look like? How can we get people on board with that? And it's interesting. So yeah, I hope there'll be a lot of fascinating experimentations in the decades ahead. And most of them will probably not work, but when we sift through all of them, hopefully somebody will be creative and come up with something that works, that other people can adopt, other nations. So yeah, we need to try to solve this.
Yeah, it's gonna take these mini experiments, but I forget now. Remind me, I guess going to back to the past. Like, remind me why China made the one-child policy to begin with. They were afraid of population, weren't they?
Yeah, so they were lifting themselves out of poverty, and they had such an enormous population that they thought that if the cities are going to be able to absorb the rural population effectively enough, we need to get down the number of children. So for that period, you could say it was smart because it helped lift people out of poverty, but then it just accentuated that, because as you become more urban, you get that strong decline in fertility. And then with the one-child policy, there's probably some residual there in the culture that isn't great today. It's not going to help them moving ahead. It's going to be a tough turnaround.
Let's kind of, I think, wrap the podcast up with kind of solutions, predictions, that kind of thing. I mean, do you think that we're going to see a return? I mean, I think, the U.S., the 2 years before the financial collapse in 2008, where they had above replacement rate. I mean, there's plenty of other countries that kind of did. Are we going to, and that wasn't that long ago. I mean, to think, that was in 2009, basically. Are we going to have a return to that? Or whether that's culturally or whatnot, or are we going to see with AI improving it, with advancements, that we're going to have people working less hours so they have more time for kids, more abundance? There's many different ways this could go. What are some of the solutions and some of the predictions?
Yeah, it's we're at the precipice now of the deepest cultural change in human history. Some argue this is the greatest introduction of novelty on this planet for 3.8 billion years since the invention of biological life wasn't an invention, since the evolution of biological life. And now we're creating digital life. We cannot know what that world is going to look like. Leading experts predict few years for AGI, a decade for automation and universal basic income in rich countries. This is going to move so fast. It's going to be such a brand new environment. And if we're able to get there, I'm very positive. Like you said, if we don't have jobs and we have material abundance, I think we're going to make a lot of children. And especially if we're also going to have to populate the solar system, I think reproduction will enter into a golden age. So yeah, that's my naive hope. That's how I see the future playing out. I want an optimistic future where humans are still around, but we can't take that for granted. It's going to be so hard just to execute that utopia, but also it could go in so many other directions. So we can't just only be naively optimistic, but some of us should be, just so that we are motivated to take this discussion instead of just giving up. Because a lot of people, including the researcher in this field, like that book I mentioned for you earlier, in 2022, he said, yeah, let's just give up. Politicians have to give up. We just have to adapt to this, to having fewer and fewer children. And I don't think we should do that. We need to try to fix this. And then, yeah, hopefully we'll enter into a great future instead of self-eradication. So, and one important point that I want to emphasize, especially for women, if you're a feminist, this should be your number one priority. The difference between an egoist and a feminist is an egoist wants freedoms and great things for themselves, but feminists should want that for all women, also those in the future. And if we don't solve this, we're headed for a future without free women. Maybe. Or a future with free robots. Who knows? But it's a fascinating challenge and definitely something we should be taking seriously.
Boy, I wish the economy Well said, by the way. I just kind of still feel like it's economical for a lot of us. I mean, I speak for myself. I probably didn't have children because I was careful because I just knew I couldn't afford to raise them, and I didn't want to be poor, and or for them to be poor. And so I think if I don't know how we're going to fix this economy, but I sure hope we do. Perhaps that might be also a great incentive for young women and families to have children because I wish I did. That's one of my one regret, and is I wish I had children.
Yeah.
Um,
At least in the US, where you're seeing a lot less men kind of going to university. And I think so many people, guys like Kai and myself were in our 40s, where we were basically like told, like, hey, if you like go for the trades, like you're a moron, you should go to college, get like more of a white collar job. But now so many people, went to university where the degree kind of means a little bit less. There's just kind of an abundance of white collar workers. And now it's like, you need people that can fix your car. You need people that are welders. You need people that are plumbers or electricians. And there's a lot of kind of barriers to entry. Like my business partner is a certified plumber, certified electrician. And you oftentimes need a certified plumber or certified electrician to sign off. Well, why would they sign off when they're just adding competition to the area? So like, it's really hard to kind of get these certifications, but we're seeing a lot more young men, especially, go into these fields, and they're just paying significantly more. So if you're, instead of going to school for 6 or 8 years and having all this college debt, you go to school for 2 years or have an apprentice where you're making money. It's just a lot easier to have kids when you're 22 with cash coming in versus 30. And then you got to keep, I got to make partner now at this law firm, or, you have kind of less goals you're hitting as a plumber or electrician or, pipe fitter or whatever. And the fact is, like, you still need people in the future to build houses. You still need people in the future to fix your car, right? These are things that you can't outsource. You can't, automate. If you can automate, you're probably automating maybe like sections of it, but not the whole. And you still have to have someone oversee the whole automation anyways, right? So do you think, like, if we're going to have men that are going to school, going to school less, making cash more, that it almost kind of creates like this, kind of like almost going back into time? And I mean, that's how it was back in the day, right? You didn't go to school for 10 years to get a job. You went to school for 2 years. I mean, my mom was an engineer for years, and she had a 2-year tech degree. And then at the end of her career, everyone she's teaching has a master's degree. She's like, why do you have a master's degree to be an engineer? Like that makes no sense.
Yeah. This world that we've grown up in and lived in is falling apart, and we're leaving it behind. And there's a new world coming towards us that's going to be radically different. I do not share your analysis to the full extent. Those robots that they're building now will, within few years, be able to, ironically, they're replacing the white collar workers first, but they will eventually get around to the blue collar work as well. So I don't think we will find meaning in labor in the future. And I suspect that's not going to be as big of a deal as people think. There's so many other things we can spend our time doing, except providing materially for ourselves. We could still have 8-hour jobs if we wanted to, but we would dedicate those efforts to creating wonderful lives for ourselves and others. So yeah, no, I don't think we're going back to a more manual labor kind of world. I think automation will eventually get to that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And what will people find meaning in?
Going out on adventures and having wonderful lives every single day. If we are all connected to an AI that's 1 billion times smarter than us and knows each and every one of us better than we know ourselves, and has a favorable impression of us and want to create good lives for us, I think that future can be very rewarding, where your days are filled with activities that you find wonderful and that you're connected with people that you're a great match for, and you go on, well, quests and adventures and things that you as an individual find fulfilling.
What do you think will be the future if this AI and all these automation doesn't come to fruition? I mean, you had, Keynes in like the 1913s or whatever saying that we would be working was it like a 15-hour work week by 2000, and people work more now than they did 50 years ago. So like there's a possibility that this doesn't necessarily lead to the future people think. So let's say like this technology doesn't take off. What does the future look like then in that scenario?
So this does absolutely not have to turn out utopian, and we have to be honest that we don't know what this technology will look like, what AGI would look like, what a fully automated world would be like, who would own it, would be able to distribute it, what are the challenges, upsides and downsides. It's really hard. But to imagine the current world just moving into the future and that isn't technologically different from the one we have now, we're just the U.S. debt's just going to keep increasing by more than $1 trillion every year, where competition is just going to get harder, where the rich are going to get richer, the poor are going to have their struggles, where mating stratification just gets even stronger, where fertility rates keep dropping. If we continue to live in the world that we live in now, I am very pessimistic regarding our ability to change. There will be a new world, but we don't know what it will look like. But some of us need to stay naively optimistic, and we need to fight for a fantastic world instead of just resigning and thinking that there's nothing we can do and we're just going to dwindle away and disappear.
Yeah, I don't want that. I definitely don't want that. Well, cheers to humanity.
Some people do. There's a lot in the debate in Norway that have argued that we don't need humans here. We're pollutant. We're evil. Especially the West is bad. We need to just let things play out and resign.
It's got to be a difficult conversation for you to have, in a coffee shop or something. But I think the Earth, we were meant to, we're sentient, I just kind of, if I were to delve deep into spiritual, I think we're here to experience the beauty of this planet, that like this planet is for us to enjoy. So God bless them for thinking that, but I sure wish for us to continue to be here and live here and experience what this is and create here. So it kind of saddened me, the thought that we would just shrink down to zero. And I used to be an environmentalist, I used to be hardcore. But yeah, I now it's like I'm really thinking about it. It's a little sentimental, but I really wish I had children. So anyway, thank you for doing what you do. Maybe this continues to inspire other women out there, young women to really take that seriously and cherish that they have that ability to bring humans into the planet.
No, thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. And thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, likewise.
Today's guest has been Mads Larsen, an author and researcher at the University of Oslo in Norway, who focuses on cultural shifts and the history of human mating through an evolutionary lens. Just kind of two final questions for you, Mads. Where can people find you, get a hold of your writings, kind of your new research? You have multiple books that are out. Where can people find those books?
Yeah, just go Google Stories of Love from Vikings to Tinder, Mads Larsen. You'll get to Taylor and Francis, and there's a link for the open access, so you can just download it for free. Start that. That's good.
Nowadays, you can just Google someone's name, which would be perfect. And then just the final question is just leave us with a final thought related to this podcast, or whatever's on your mind.
We are so fortunate to live in the most exciting time that ever has existed. The unfortunate part of that is that we evolved for stability. We want to know what is true. We want to know who we belong with. We want to know toward which future we're building. When we're in this transitional periods, we lose that, and it feels terrible, and it has all kinds of negative impacts. But we need to keep our focus on the prize, and that is that we have the opportunity now to create fantastic societies 10, 20, 30 years down the road. And it's painful. These transitions are annoying, but they're also very exciting, and we should focus on that as well.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.